Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and today we're reading a book that I read for the first time last week because that was what I picked up to read. And since I liked it and I hadn't really decided what to do, then that's what I'm doing for this week's video, which for the record is actually a couple videos ahead of this one because once in a while I get ahead and that's really great. But anyways, so The Shattered Court by M.J. Scott, who I know nothing about beyond the fact that this person has written a couple series, because there are apparently more series in this Novel of the Four Arts series thing. Anyways, so this is basically a book set in what I feel is a fairly popular fantasy setting, and that is not Earth. Like, you know, that whole not exclamation point, whatever, that this is not England, it's Anglios, and it's not France across the way, it's something that I'm not entirely certain how the author wants us to pronounce. And the thing about these sorts of novels is that they're fantasy novels based on the notion that what if we had magic on planet Earth? That would shift the socio-political structure of the world around even just a little. Because if you assume humans still evolved in Africa and moved out into the Middle East and so on and so forth, as they did in actual prehistory, we would, you would have certain consistencies in terms of how culture developed because they would have, passed through the same geographical areas, would have undergone the same circumstances surrounding it, but because there is magic in these fictional worlds, it would mean that there would probably be some people who would survive where previously they had been wiped out. You would have some people who would have advantages of magic that they did not have in actual reality. And so this book is set in a not England, which is as Britain is, pardon me. It's set on the British Isles. It's not, they call it Anglios, and so it's roughly the British Isles, but the thing is, I'm not entirely certain, and I don't even know how certain this author is, of whether we have a single united place, or whether it is, as in our genuine history, split between England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales in that sort of clump of islands off of the west coast of Europe. So, this is sort of a little bit out there in terms of how much consistency with the real world it has, but it's very clear that we are at least intended to look at this as a sort of pseudo-England. And the thing about England, one of the things that made it, have its independence in its way is you have these various peoples on the British Isles, and they're on an island. It means that in order to invade, you have to cross the English Channel, you have to get there, and that is a tremendous bulwark that allows one to avoid a certain amount of invasion simply because staging an invasion is not a matter of marching your army up to the border and walking across. Anyway, so they have an ongoing fight with the people on the other side of the channel who are not French. And what we have here is an interesting story about a young woman who, in this reality, if you're going to wind up with magic, it sort of matures at your 21st birthday. And so she's going to have a vaguely Gaelic sounding party when she turns 21 to celebrate her coming into her power or not. But there's also a whole bunch of ritual and stuff. Anyways, when it starts, the thing about this book is this is one of those books where our lead character sort of is drifting along on the surface of various court intrigues. I mean, she is aware that court intrigues exist, but that what happens is the day before her birthday, the day before she is supposed to come into her power, the palace is attacked, and she and one of the guardsmen take off running and sort of flee into the countryside, because basically he says, listen, you are, in line for the throne. Maybe not anywhere close to it. You're like 21st in line, but the fact is, you're nonetheless in line for the throne, and as I am out with you today and I'm a royal guardsman, it is my duty to keep you safe, and that means getting you the heck out of the city. So they go trundling around, and she misses her big event and wakes up having all of her magic, sort of come out of there. And these are clearly romance novels, because we have a dramatic, magic-induced sex scene that she sort of wakes up, has magic, looks at a ley line, and the guardsman with her, Cameron, likens it to being drunk, that she sort of touched the ley line and got a blast of magic, and it sort of threw her into a tizzy, and then she sort of threw the magic at him, and he got into a tizzy, and they basically have sex in the woods, which is kind of a big deal because she's supposed to be kept a virgin until, after her big dramatic thing. And it isn't until they get back that we find out that the whole remaining a virgin, all of this stuff, is way, way more significant than just ritual and, the standard patriarchal control over women thing. Because it turns out that they don't just let women walk off with all this magic, they bind it to their church, to the pseudo-church replacement. And it's very, very interesting because our lead character, she got into this, and like I said, I don't think that she was unaware that court intrigues existed, but it's sort of that she was expecting to wade through a regular pool, and then all of a sudden there's just a drop-off under her as she discovers her magic would have been bound, that her sleeping with poor Cameron, and no, I don't remember her name off the top of my head. I'm terrible with names. The only reason I remember names in so many books in this series is because I've reread those books 83,000 times, so it got dinned into my head. I will say this. If I didn't have to remember my own name, I probably wouldn't. Anyways, so the thing is that there's just this unexpected drop-off, and all of a sudden she finds herself in a situation where her magic was supposed to be bound to the temple, and it's not, and the priestess, who is, the highest ranking person in the land in relation to the religion, is abruptly very, very upset with her and starts to dislike her very intensely, and it's mostly because she has all of her power, it is not bound to anything, and this is very much one of those moves that I was recently thinking about, and I find that the people who make these moves that wind up causing somebody to run away and leave, the villain finds out that she can't bind this person's magic, and just basically assumes that our heroine will decide to try to take over the country or something. This hasn't been made explicit, but there was an attempt on her life at the end of the book, and she and her newly collected husband, because they find out that she slept with Cameron, and they say, okay, fine, then we're going to marry you off to him because your magic is already entwined with his, and we can't foist you off on somebody who would be a better match for political purposes. So we're just going to have to pretend that this is totally just a thing that we wanted to do. Anyway, so she and Cameron have to flee the country because they get attacked by somebody who was hired to assassinate her. Possibly both of them. But the thing is that I have no doubt that in the second book in the series, which I have duly taken out of the library and will possibly tell you about, assuming I like it, I don't know, I haven't read it yet, that they're probably going to come back and wind up having to, take over the country or force the Domina out of power or something. That this is going to be one of those things where none of this would have happened if you hadn't assumed that she would be unfaithful to the cause. And I always feel like that's sort of projection, that you have these power-hungry people who assume that somebody else is ultimately because of projection. Because somebody who's that kind of power-hungry is probably thinking, wow, if my magic were unbound, I would totally try to take over the country. So if I would, then clearly so would everybody else. I feel like that's one of the big personal flaws, not a writing flaw, but a character flaw in, villains, that a lot of villains in situations where they drive away the lead character who then comes back and becomes king or whatever, that I feel like most of the time it's that big character flaw of assuming that because they would do something like this in this situation, that so too would everyone else. And that if they would just sit down and be quiet, then none of this trouble would happen. But because they're ambitious and they have to get ahead of things, they try to get ahead of something that would never have happened if they hadn't forced it to happen. It's a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy thing. I decide that this is what the future is going to be, so I am going to try to move to stop it, and then in the process, I'm going to cause it. Not an Oedipus Rex sort of thing where somebody third party told him, but just, I assume people are like this, so I'm going to act like everyone is like this, and then they're going to be like this in response to my being like that. Anyways, so this is an interesting book. It's not... I would say that this is very much of a piece with these kinds of books. That is, these slightly romantic fantasy novels set in a not Earth, in not 18th century, not England. There's sort of this weird sub-genre of fantasy novels that are this. And it's an interesting thing, because having just gotten off of finishing Lord of the Rings, I find that these novels, on the one hand, it's a perfectly valid what if magic were real in our actual planet Earth with our actual, plants and animals and stuff. But there's a small part of me that looks at that and says, if you want to make up your fantasy world, why don't you just make up your fantasy world? Because then it doesn't matter if what you're doing is remotely historically inaccurate, because it's your fantasy world and you can decide what it's like. Granted, world building, genuine, real, consistent world building is harder when you're going to have to build up your whole geography and everything. But I wonder sometimes looking at these. Anyways, so yeah, brand new author to me, brand new series to me, so I don't have a lot of thoughts, even though I've managed to talk for about 15 minutes. But yeah, so I liked it. It's not deep, but it's fun. It's a good time. So yeah, that's everything, and I will see you all next week.